A 12-year-old boy was sentenced to prison for a crime he did not commit. His desperate mother risked everything to prove his innocence. What she did next changed everything. The sun was just rising on the horizon when Mariana slowly pushed open the door to her modest apartment. She had finished her work shift only a few minutes earlier, and the exhaustion showed in her reddened eyes. Her steps were slow on the wooden floor, which creaked with every movement, yet she raised her voice in a gentle greeting to her son, Luke. He was already awake, tying the laces of his worn-out sneakers. He was getting ready for school, backpack slung over his shoulder, eyes shining with enthusiasm as they did every morning. Mariana and Luke had only a few moments to exchange loving words before she said goodbye with a kiss on his cheek and headed, utterly spent, toward her room. As she prepared to shower, Mariana paused briefly at the door of Frank's room, her father and Luke's grandfather. The elderly man was sitting in his favorite armchair, an oxygen tank beside him. Hearing her, he turned to offer a tired smile, with a gesture indicating everything was under control. Although his most active days were behind him, Frank remained sharp and, above all, carried a steely resolve forged through decades of police service. The light in his eyes revealed the pride he felt for his family, despite the hardships life had thrown their way. Aware of her own fatigue, Mariana felt a fleeting sense of relief knowing her father would look after Luke while she got a few hours of rest. In the kitchen, Luke hurriedly drank a glass of milk before heading out. Frank, with some effort, beckoned his grandson to come closer. He straightened up in his chair and, after adjusting his oxygen tube, began recounting yet another story from his days in the police force. Luke listened intently, fascinated by the idea of his grandfather as a street hero. That day, the tale revolved around the time Frank and his fellow officers caught a car thief in the old marketplace. Luke imagined the adrenaline and tension of the chase. Frank stressed the importance of honesty, of never being tempted by corruption, and of always standing up for the truth, no matter the circumstances. With a fond hug, Luke promised to always remember those words, and Frank, proud, gave him a few gentle pats on the shoulder before letting him go. At school, Luke's enthusiasm shone particularly bright during PE class. On the track, he ran with determination as the cold morning air cut his breath and turned his cheeks red. His teacher, Alice Suarez, watched him closely. She had long noticed Luke's great potential and often mentioned to other teachers that this boy could excel in youth competitions if given the chance. Rather than feeling intimidated, Luke responded with more effort, sensing that with each long, steady stride, he could break through the limitations of his everyday life. When evening arrived, Mariana's hours of rest ended. She said goodbye to Luke, who excitedly told her about his progress on the track and Alice's positive remarks. She smiled tenderly, proud of him, but she knew she had to leave for her night shift, cleaning a government building. Before leaving, she cast a nervous glance around the neighborhood, where graffiti warnings testified to a tense reality. Messages like, "Pay up" or "Face the consequences," and references to the fierce were sprayed on the walls, signs of a looming threat. Mariana boarded the bus and left behind the silhouette of the grey buildings in the housing complex. Night fell over the neighborhood, and every dim streetlight seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging in the air. Commuting to work while her son slept had never been easy, but she preferred sacrificing her own rest if it meant keeping their home afloat. Still, that night, something in the air felt different. She had a vague foreboding of bigger trouble, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Meanwhile, Luke was having dinner with Frank at the apartment. The TV on low volume showed headlines about local robberies and warnings of growing extortion cases. Frank, frowning, switched it off, wanting to spare his grandson any additional worry. Outside, the shadows seemed to stretch out, cloaking the streets with an almost oppressive atmosphere. Luke felt a slight chill and couldn't help but worry about his mother, who at that hour was cleaning nearly empty offices. Even so, he trusted she would make it home safely at dawn. Night fell with that subtle hum of tension creeping through the walls of the neighborhood. spray-painted alarm messages served as a warning of something shady unfolding. No one yet grasped the magnitude of what was coming, but they felt it in the air. In some way, the apparent calm was only the prelude to a darker chapter. In that atmosphere, Mariana exhausted, Luke restless in his sleep, the day ended in routine, with no one suspecting the abrupt twist fate had in store for the family. Early morning shadows still cloaked the streets when phones started ringing in various local shops. The calls were brief, voices distorted, demanding protection payments. The shopkeepers were shocked by these aggressive threats, urging them to exchange money for so-called safety. Many hung up immediately, heart pounding, not knowing whom to turn to in order to report what was clearly extortion. Among those most affected was the owner of a small local market, a rugged-looking man who, fed up with crime in the area, firmly refused to pay a single cent. He decided he would not let himself be bullied by faceless callers. Yet as he walked to the door to open his shop, he couldn't ignore the knot tightening in his stomach at the thought of possible repercussions. That same morning, in a lavish municipal banquet hall, a public ceremony took place with several business owners and local leaders in attendance. Among them was Thomas Mangione, a politician climbing the ranks on promises to improve security and encourage investment in the neighborhood. He wore a dark, impeccable suit, speaking smoothly as he thanked the business people around him. In a resolute tone, he assured the audience that under his leadership, the ongoing insecurity would be put to an end, and he vowed to invest in social programs and new equipment for the local police. However, there were whispers buzzing throughout the room. A couple of business owners leaned in to quietly comment on Mangione's dubious reputation. Rumor had it his hands weren't as clean as he claimed, and that a large share of the anti-crime funds ended up in untraceable accounts. Still, in public, everyone praised him, hoping to maintain a cordial relationship with a man whose power grew day by day. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Luke left school with his backpack bouncing at every step. He headed toward athletics practice, excited to test his track abilities. However, a scene he witnessed at a nearby warehouse made him uneasy. A shopkeeper was arguing with someone who demanded money. Though Luke didn't fully understand what was happening, he sensed the tense atmosphere. A passing neighbor pulled him aside for a moment, whispering with worry that the neighborhood situation was getting worse, that many people were receiving threats, and that he should be extra careful, especially because of his mother, Mariana, who worked at night. With a sinking feeling, Luke continued on to the athletics track. As much as he tried to focus on his warm-up and on teacher Alice Suarez's instructions, he couldn't shake the thought of Mariana and the growing sense of insecurity spreading throughout the neighborhood. Even so, he forced himself to push through and complete his training session, hoping that everything would be peaceful when he got back home. When evening came, Mariana finished her cleaning shift at the government building. She felt the usual weariness after several hours of work, but that night, she also carried a deepening sense of unease. She said goodbye to the few remaining employees wandering the halls, gathered her belongings, and set off for home. Passing by a wall lit only by a flickering street lamp, she noticed fresh, oversized graffiti reading, "Pay up or face the consequences," signed with a sloppy scrawl suggesting the alias, The Fierce. Mariana froze, heart pounding, as she read those words. She couldn't help but feel overcome by fear. She recalled the extortion tales whispered among her neighbors and felt a chill at the likelihood that these threats were more than just rumors. She quickened her pace until she reached the building where she lived with Luke and Frank. Inside the apartment, she did her best to act normal, though her hand trembled slightly as she unlocked the door. Luke greeted her with a smile, but quickly noticed his mother's serious expression. Not wanting to alarm him, she distracted him with questions about his day and his progress in training. Still, she felt a persistent alarm going off inside her, impossible to ignore. That night, the neighborhood seemed even less peaceful than usual. The glow of the streetlights reflected on shuttered windows, and in the alleys, long, threatening shadows loomed. In some corners, small groups of young people gathered quietly, while rumors of the fierce and his extortions spread block by block. These signs pointed to something brewing. Conditions were ripe for tensions to boil over. The memory of that graffiti lingered in Mariana's mind. She knew difficult weeks lay ahead. Even though she couldn't yet fathom the gravity of the danger, she could feel that the neighborhood was heating up and that chaos was steadily closing in. Darkness settled softly over the city, and the lights from the buildings reflected on the pavement, dampened by a light drizzle. Mariana arrived at the government building a little before 10 p.m., her usual cleaning schedule. She entered through the rear door, greeted by a stern-faced security guard who gave her a mechanical nod to let her in. Without delay, Mariana got to work. She checked her supplies, tied her hair back in a quick bun, and started cleaning the offices on the first floor. The place was nearly deserted, save for a few lights on in distant hallways and the faint clacking of keyboards in a solitary office where a late-shift employee was finishing a report. As she passed the mop down the corridor, she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She set the mop aside, dried her hands, and answered. It was Luke, sounding excited on the other end of the line. He was bursting to tell her he felt ready for the next morning's athletics training, and that teacher Alice Suarez had mentioned that if he kept improving, he'd have the chance to compete in upcoming school events. Mariana smiled at the sound of his voice. Though she was clearly tired, her pride as a mother also shone through. She told Luke to get a good night's sleep, reminding him not to stay up late, and promised to wake him when she got home. After hanging up, Mariana stood there for a few seconds with the phone in her hand, reflecting on the unfairness of having so little time to spend with her son. Still, she shook her head and got back to her tasks. She knew that, exhausting as it was, this job was what allowed them to get by. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, the owner of the small market who had refused to pay extortion money was about to close. A strong-willed man, he did one last check of the cash register and his inventory before turning off most of the lights. He left just one dim bulb on by the entrance, as he did every night. He had no idea that outside in the rain-stained darkness, two hooded figures were watching him through the glass. They approached silently. One pushed the door open, and the owner looked up warily as they walked in. He had no time to resist. One of the hooded figures pointed a gun at him, demanding the payment he had refused. Terrified, the man raised both hands, shaking his head, trying to explain that he didn't want trouble. But the hooded figure didn't give him the chance to negotiate. Within moments, the silence was shattered by a series of gunshots. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. The shopkeeper fell heavily to the floor, blood spreading across the cracked tile. In the struggle, one of the intruders accidentally kicked an object, which landed beside the merchant's lifeless body. It was a dark-colored wallet, plastered with childlike stickers on the cover. In the flicker of the dim light, you could just make out a name, written in marker on the inside lining. Luke Jones. The assailants, failing to notice it, fled into the night with their loot, leaving a horrific silence behind. Alarmed neighbors in adjacent buildings had heard the shots and, horrified, called the police. Sirens blared a few minutes later, filling the block with red and blue lights that bounced off wet walls. One of the first patrol cars to arrive was driven by Sub-Officer Davis, a surly-faced cop with a rigid demeanor. He got out of the car, hand poised over his holster, and went into the mini-market, pushing through the small crowd that had gathered. Kneeling beside the victim, he lifted his gaze and shone his flashlight on the wallet lying on the floor. With great care, he picked it up and noted the name on it. Recognizing the inscription, he looked up at his colleagues and declared in a grave, certain tone, as if he'd found the missing piece of a puzzle, "We have a suspect, Luke Jones." In that moment, the atmosphere in the shop grew oppressively heavy. The news spread quickly. A 12-year-old boy, son of a cleaning lady, had become the main suspect in a brutal murder. No one could comprehend how or why this had happened, but Sub-Officer Davis's focus was already on Luke. Meanwhile, entirely unaware, Mariana continued her nightly routine, clueless that her family's life was on the brink of a devastating upheaval. Dawn crept on as Inspector Logan Woods arrived at the crime scene. Night dew clung to the pavement, and the red and blue glare of the patrol cars lit up puddles around the mini-market. Woods, a serious-faced man with features hardened by years of service, spoke briefly with the officers securing the perimeter. His gaze immediately shifted to Sub-Officer Davis, who stood off to one side, tightly gripping a child's wallet labeled Luke Jones in marker. Davis approached Woods, showing him the object with a blend of aloofness and expectation. The inspector frowned, first examining the shopkeeper's corpse inside the store, then scrutinizing the wallet in Davis's hands. At that very moment, the patrol car's radio crackled harshly, and the voice from police headquarters broke through the static. "There's panic in the area. We demand immediate results. We can't tolerate any more unsolved crimes." Woods felt the pressure descending squarely on his shoulders. He knew that in highly sensitive cases like this, the higher-ups tended to seek culprits without pausing over details, more concerned about quelling public alarm than conducting a thorough investigation. With a resigned huff, the inspector ordered his team to collect all available evidence. But Davis, with a defiant look, insisted that the only solid lead they had was the wallet found next to the body. "We have a name, Inspector, and it belongs to a kid who apparently was close to the victim or had some connection to him," the sub-officer declared, emphasizing each word. Woods eyed him warily. Something about Davis's logic seemed hasty, but at the same time he felt the urgency to deliver a suspect, as the higher-ups demanded. The next day, barely after sunrise, Woods and Davis headed to the modest building where the Jones family lived. The morning light lit up the narrow hallway of the apartment complex, and the quiet stirrings of the neighbors waking up served as backdrop to the two officers' footsteps. They knocked on the door insistently. Mariana, still groggy from her night shift, opened up and froze at the gravity in their faces. Luke, who was in the kitchen sipping a glass of milk, came over to ask what was going on. With a brusque gesture, Davis pulled out his handcuffs and announced that the boy was under investigation for the shopkeeper's murder. "What are you accusing him of?" Mariana exclaimed, her voice full of shock. "He's only a 12-year-old boy." "His wallet was found at the crime scene," Davis answered, leaving no room for argument. "That proves nothing," Mariana insisted, raising her voice. "My son was here last night, asleep. He hasn't done anything wrong." However, the mother's protests failed to stop the arrest. Woods, visibly uncomfortable, merely oversaw the procedure. Luke remained quiet, his expression bewildered, unable to comprehend why he was being taken away like a criminal. Frank, the grandfather, emerged from his room struggling to breathe, coughing and clutching his oxygen tank at the sight of his grandson in handcuffs. He tried to intervene, but only managed a few steps before being overtaken by a coughing fit that left him gasping for air. Mariana rushed to support him, screaming at the officers that this was all a mistake. Within seconds, the scene spiraled into chaos. Mariana's cries, Frank's violent cough, Luke's terrified look, Davis barking orders for everyone to step aside. Finally, the boy was led to the police car and placed in the back seat, stifling tears as his heart pounded. It felt like a nightmare, but the clinking of the handcuffs against the seat confirmed it was horribly real. A few hours later, Judge Vilches, known for his inflexible temperament, received the case with unusual speed. After reviewing the preliminary report, the photos, and the wallet that had been found, he decided to order pre-trial detention for Luke. Although there was no direct testimony placing the boy at the scene, the judge justified his ruling by citing circumstantial evidence and the vague statements from some neighbors as reason enough to proceed. Given the neighborhood's violent context, he claimed, drastic measures were necessary. Those accustomed to the slow-moving gears of the justice system exchanged glances, stunned by the swiftness of his decision. In the midst of this disbelief, Luke's life changed overnight. He was no longer just a student with athletic dreams, but a suspected criminal accused of homicide. Mariana, overwhelmed, left the courthouse clutching the ruling without understanding how the system could act with such immediate coldness toward an innocent child. As she walked, gripping the document that confirmed her son's pre-trial detention, she felt her legs quake at the enormity of what lay ahead. Luke, for his part, couldn't begin to process the situation. All he knew was that, from one day to the next, he had become the prime suspect in a murder he'd never committed. The cloak of injustice settled over them both, and the uncertainty of what might come next struck them with chilling force. When the apartment door closed behind her, Mariana felt an intense chill, unrelated to the breeze outside. It was a blend of desperation and loneliness creeping into every corner. Only a few hours had passed since Luke had been taken to a police facility, and her mind was still tangled in the last image she had of him in the patrol car, handcuffed, bewildered. Anger and helplessness surged within her. Yet she told herself she would not allow injustice to win. She was prepared to do anything to prove her son's innocence. Her first thought was to hire a private lawyer. She recalled hearing about a few top criminal attorneys rumored to be unrelenting in court. But when she finally reached one of them, she was faced with astronomical fees, far beyond anything she could afford. A lump rose in her throat as she listened to his polished voice quoting impossible sums, even for a simple initial consultation. Each word reminded her of the huge gulf separating modest families from swift, effective justice. Dazed and frustrated, she left the small law office with helplessness etched on her face. How could she scrape together such a staggering amount of money when she already struggled to meet daily expenses? That was when someone mentioned the possibility of going to the public defender's office. She knew of it, but wasn't sure if they had the expertise for such a complex case. Still, she clung to that option like a lifeline. The following morning, Mariana showed up at the public defender's office, hopeful for answers. After filling out a lengthy form and waiting in a crowded room full of people in situations as bad or worse than hers, she was finally called into a small office where she met Clara Johnson. The young public defender, hair pulled back and eyes full of resolve, might have looked inexperienced, but something genuine shone through in the way she spoke to Mariana. She addressed her kindly, with an idealism Mariana hadn't heard in a lawyer's voice for a very long time. "The first thing is to clearly understand the case," Clara explained, quickly scanning the documents. "I want to help you, Ms. Mariana. Your son has the right to be presumed innocent and to receive a fair defense." "He's just a child," Mariana replied, fighting back her tears. "I don't see how anyone can believe he killed that man." As Clara sifted through the sparse paperwork, she jotted down some contact information and promised to begin filing an appeal against the pre-trial detention. She explained that, though the situation was complicated, they shouldn't lose hope. Despite the lawyer's obvious lack of experience, her determination to fight was a glimmer of hope for a mother pushed to her breaking point. Later that day, back at home, Mariana sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, which she had no real desire to drink. Her hands shook slightly. The apartment walls felt more oppressive than ever. She couldn't get Luke's face out of her mind for even a second. Almost on reflex, she picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. That of Jorge Ramirez, an old childhood friend who had joined the police force. After a couple of rings, Jorge's guarded voice answered. Recognizing her, he sounded surprised, but he listened intently as she explained the situation. Now a low-ranking officer at the same precinct as Woods, Jorge seemed moved by her plight. Though he didn't wield much influence, he promised to look into everything he could about the case and the reports used to incriminate Luke. "Let me check the internal files. There might be something that doesn't add up," he said, trying to sound optimistic. No sooner had she hung up than Mariana felt she had awakened ghosts from a past she thought she'd left behind. She remembered how she and Jorge, as kids, used to play in the schoolyard, laughing over silly things. Now, both were adults facing a daunting reality. Still, she felt a slight sense of relief, knowing not all officers turned a blind eye to the truth. At least there was a ray of hope. Frank, for his part, also refused to sit idle. Despite his severe respiratory limitations, he picked up the phone and dialed the numbers of old colleagues from his days on the force. His hoarse voice broke into fits of coughing, but he persisted, begging each one for any information or lead that might help. Several confided disturbing rumors. There was pressure from upper command, even from political figures, to close the case quickly. The shopkeeper's murder had set off alarms, and outraged citizens demanded an immediate culprit. With his wallet found at the scene, young Luke was the perfect scapegoat to channel all that public anger. When Frank finally hung up for the last time that day, his exhaustion showed in every line of his face. He breathed heavily, clutching his oxygen tank and leaning against an old armchair that creaked under his weight. Nevertheless, his eyes, filled with stubborn resolve, reflected the rage of a man who refused to surrender. The day ended with Mariana feeling trapped. It was as though a massive wall had risen between her and her son's freedom. The legal system, institutional pressure, and the tide of rumors made Luke the perfect fall guy. And yet, within that darkness, she had managed to spark a few faint lights. Clara the lawyer, inexperienced but courageous, and Jorge, a friend bold enough to question his own superior's work. With Frank making urgent phone calls, the family found themselves at the beginning of a lopsided battle against a faceless enemy. Unbeknownst to them, they were taking the first steps on a difficult and perilous road, one that would test their resolve and faith in justice. The police van rolled silently down narrow streets, accompanied only by the drone of its engine and the dull thump of tires over poorly patched potholes. Seated in the back, Luke still had his hands cuffed, his gaze fixed on the metal floor. His legs trembled despite his efforts to look composed. He'd heard rumors about juvenile detention centers, terrifying stories whispered at school, but never imagined that, at just 12, he'd end up in one himself. Upon arriving at the grey, high-walled facility, a surly-looking guard opened the vehicle's door and ordered him to step out. Luke felt a blast of frigid air slap his face, mingled with the stale odor from the surrounding walls. Further ahead stood a structure with barred, tiny windows, cramped hallways, and barbed wire coiled atop the fence. Two officers escorted him down a corridor with cracked tiles, steel doors slamming shut behind them at each step. Each slamming door made Luke feel that freedom was slipping further away. A younger guard handled some basic paperwork, asking for Luke's full name, age, and other details, which he answered in a barely audible voice. Immediately after, they took him into a room where they searched his clothing and possessions. They removed the laces from his sneakers and confiscated anything they deemed dangerous. Luke kept his eyes down, determined not to cry. Inside, though, his anxiety grew into a hard lump, and his childlike pride insisted he hold it together. Eventually, he was led to the cell block and dorm areas, where the hallways were bleak and the lights flickered, leaving certain corners dim. He spotted other kids, most older than he, wandering around with hard or downtrodden expressions. An officer guided him to a small bunk in a room shared by several other youths. That was where he met Mauro, a 16-year-old who immediately stood out as a sort of leader among the inmates. Mauro had a defiant glare, and when he spotted Luke, he smirked mockingly. "What are you doing here, kid?" Mauro asked with a dismissive tone. I don't know. They say I killed someone, but I didn't," Luke managed to stammer, feeling more vulnerable than ever before. The derisive laughter was swift. Mauro glanced at his friends, who also jeered at the apparent weakness of the newcomer. Luke felt his chest tighten. Though he didn't understand the social hierarchy of this place, he knew that showing fear would mark him as an easy target. Yet it was difficult to keep his nerves in check, and his voice quivered as he tried to explain himself. A couple of older kids drew close, as if ready to shove him, but Mauro merely watched it happen with indifference. When Luke failed to respond beyond uneasy stammering, he gave his friends a signal to back off. However, he didn't offer any help or protection. He only made it clear he was in charge of that grim little world. Shortly after, a staff member called Luke and led him to the psychologist's office. The room was tiny, furnished with a metal table and 2 chairs. Posters about anger management and the importance of rehabilitation hung on the walls, though most were faded and peeling from the humidity. The psychologist, whose eyes betrayed her weariness from handling too many cases, asked Luke to sit. She tried to chat with him about his life, his family, and why he'd been locked up. But he could barely manage to speak. He felt trapped, unable to grasp why he'd been named the killer of a man he'd never even met. Each question she asked rang like a reminder of the senseless injustice he was caught in. And in the back of his mind, all he could picture was the worried faces of his mother and grandfather. The psychologist, noticing Luke's resistance, sighed in resignation. She was used to dealing with kids who had gone through traumatic experiences, but the pressure of an overburdened system prevented her from offering the support he truly needed. After a brief exchange, she ended the session and let him know he'd be summoned again some other time. With a vacant expression, Luke left the office, unclear about what lay ahead. Night had fallen by the time most of the lights in the reform school clicked off. In the dorm, one could hear whispers, sinister chuckles, and the occasional shout from distant hallways. Lying on a bunk, equipped with a thin mattress and a strong odor, Luke clung to his pillow as though it were a shield. Around him, some inmates kept talking in hushed tones, while others simply snored or stayed awake in tense watchfulness. Between the sound of footsteps and the echo of threats rattling through the walls, the boy realized he was trapped in a frightening, unfamiliar world. Violence could erupt at any moment, and he had no clue how to protect himself. He shut his eyes but found no rest. The cold night air, the shifting shadows on the ceiling, and the memory of his unjust accusation made every second feel like torment. Every far-off scream reminded him he was now in a place governed by brute force, and he, just a defenseless kid, had to find a way to hold on. In his mind, he prayed for dawn to break, hoping a new day would bring at least a glimmer of salvation, and that someone on the outside was battling to free him. Without knowing it, those endless nights of fear and uncertainty were where he would begin forging the resilience he so desperately needed. Sofia Barreto stepped out of the taxi in a hurry, adjusting her bag on her shoulder while rechecking the notes in her phone for the umpteenth time. She'd spent days arranging the meetings and interviews necessary for her upcoming piece. Under that cloudy afternoon sky, the young journalist headed to a small cafe located 1 block from the neighborhood's center. There, she was set to meet the first of several shopkeepers who had agreed to talk to her, on condition of complete anonymity. Sofia chose the place for its privacy, a modest spot with just a handful of tables, where low lighting and covered windows offered an ideal hideout for a discreet conversation. For weeks, Sofia had been gathering clues, suggesting a major power struggle in the neighborhood between a criminal group and several residents who refused to pay extortion money. Many local business owners had received threats and, in some cases, attacks. Among the rumors in circulation, one name surfaced repeatedly: the fierce Maldonado, described as the leader of a violent gang dedicated to extortion. The deeper Sofia dug into her investigation, the more proof she found that this gang was expanding its influence, aided by the inaction, or worse, the complicity, of certain officials. Her first interviewee, a middle-aged man, looked exhausted and on edge, with deep circles under his eyes and fidgety gestures. Sofia used her phone to record only his voice, honoring his request not to show his face. In a low, shaky tone, he described the threatening calls, anonymous letters, and even menacing visits he'd experienced at his shop. The fierce and his people, he said, were as direct as they came. They demanded protection fees, with the threat of doing serious harm to anyone who refused. Other merchants in the area confirmed the story, but few dared speak openly. Sofia noticed how just mentioning that nickname was enough to make them uneasy. However, the plot didn't stop at street-level criminals. Each testimonial hinted at something bigger. There were rumors that a local politician, Thomas Mangione, was either involved or turning a blind eye for personal gain. Mangione had made a name for himself by promising to improve security and throwing lavish events with wealthy sponsors, which had helped him amass significant power in the municipality. Sofia unearthed evidence of shady construction permits, misappropriation of public funds, and suspicious deals rumored to finance his campaigns. Official records appeared clean, yet various sources insisted that dirty money was fueling the very extortion crippling the neighborhood. Propelled by journalistic integrity, Sofia spent days chasing these leads. She combed through archived documents at City Hall, interviewed people close to Mangione, and compared notes with fellow reporters probing local corruption. Nearly all of them confirmed the politician's meteoric rise was suspicious, but no one felt safe calling him out in public. Fear of retaliation was palpable, and those daring enough to speak about him did so only in whispers and under conditions of anonymity. Eventually, Sofia caught wind of Luke Jones's case. A colleague told her that a 12-year-old boy had been recently sent to a juvenile facility, accused of murdering a shopkeeper who had refused to pay extortion. The detail immediately caught her attention. How could they charge a child so young with such a vicious crime? Investigating further, she saw that the headlines fixated on Luke as the alleged culprit, solely because his wallet was found at the crime scene. Sofia suspected they'd pinned the murder on a scapegoat, conveniently diverting suspicion from the real offenders. Someone clearly needed a quick solution to calm the public outcry. She soon managed to get in touch with Mariana Jones. After several unsuccessful tries, Sofia finally reached her by phone, and the mother's trembling voice confirmed her suspicions. She explained how her son had been abruptly arrested, all on the weak basis of that wallet. The woman pleaded with Sofia to help expose the injustice, terrified that her son would end up paying for the misdeeds of far more dangerous criminals. That plea cemented Sofia's resolve. Luke's predicament was not just a heartbreaking family ordeal, it was the tip of an iceberg involving police officers, politicians, and gangsters. Sofia opened her laptop and started drafting a piece outlining the connections between the fierce Maldonado, Mangione, and the surge in neighborhood extortion. She knew the article might alarm powerful figures, but it also had the potential to awaken the public conscience. Luke deserved the chance to have his story heard, and Sofia was willing to take a risk to make it happen. Once she saved all her gathered data, she glanced at the clock. Night had already settled in. She took a deep breath, well aware that taking the next step meant venturing into dangerous territory. Still, the thought of an innocent child locked away for a crime he didn't commit kept her from backing down. She vowed to chase every lead until she could unmask those responsible, convinced that in this tangled web of special interests, the truth would eventually come out. Morning arrived thick with tension at the local police station. Inspector Logan Woods shut himself in his office to review, yet again, the files about the murdered shopkeeper. On his desk lay stacks of documents, crime scene photos, initial statements, and above all, the evidence pointing to Luke Jones as the killer. He reread key paragraphs, brow furrowed in concentration. How could a 12-year-old possibly subdue and murder a grown man? The scenario made no sense, and each line he pored over only strengthened his doubt. Woods's concern showed in the tense set of his jaw. He tossed the papers onto the desk and rubbed his forehead. He'd been on the force long enough to recognize when a case didn't add up. Sure, the boy's wallet had been found at the scene, and a witness claimed to have seen Luke in the area. But in the inspector's experience, a single neighbor's word or an object that might have been planted was hardly definitive, especially when the suspect was a minor with no record. His train of thought was interrupted by Sub-Officer Davis, who burst in without knocking. Pushing the glass door aside, Davis demanded, "Inspector, why are you still combing through this? We know who did it, don't we?" Davis's challenging tone set Woods on edge. From the night of the crime, the sub-officer had insisted the matter was settled, that there was no sense in overthinking. Yet Woods had come across multiple inconsistencies. Maintaining a steady voice, he pointed out contradictions in the witness statements and in the alleged reconstruction of events. How could a kid like Luke overpower a tough adult without drawing attention or leaving any obvious signs of struggle. "Davis, this doesn't stack up," Woods reiterated, fighting to rein in his frustration, "and the witnesses' accounts aren't all that solid." "What more do you need?" Davis shot back, his tone aggressive. "The kid's wallet was there. People say they saw him hanging around. All these doubts do is drag out the process unnecessarily." A knot formed in Woods's stomach at Davis's harshness. He knew the brass upstairs demanded quick results. The neighborhood wanted answers. Political pressure was intense. Yet his investigative instincts wouldn't let him rubber stamp such a dubious conclusion. He resolved to verify each detail before endorsing a guilty verdict that made little sense. Later that afternoon, while grabbing coffee near the station, Woods received an unexpected visit. Jorge Ramirez, a young officer. Jorge sat down across from him and admitted he'd known Mariana Jones since childhood. Leaning in, he confessed that the accusation against Luke simply didn't fit. "That boy doesn't have the strength or the malice to kill anyone," he insisted. Then he added that something about Davis's behavior seemed off. He'd noticed the sub-officer acting suspiciously. Woods, taken aback by the younger man's candor, listened carefully. Jorge also brought up the night of the murder, saying there should have been security camera footage from the area, but mysteriously, it was nowhere to be found. The logs suggested someone had erased the videos or neglected to submit them as evidence. Woods's alarms went off. Why would someone destroy footage that could clarify events unless they were trying to hide the truth? At that point, the inspector's suspicions zeroed in on Davis. He remembered how Davis had found Luke's wallet almost immediately at the scene and how fervently he backed the story that pinned the boy as the killer. Woods wrestled with whether to remain loyal to the institution or to pursue the facts. He knew the higher-ups frowned upon any officer who questioned the tidy, case-closed narrative. But his career experience and his conscience wouldn't let him turn a blind eye. If there was evidence tampering, it could involve more than one officer, and perhaps even higher political circles. Before leaving, Jorge gave him a firm reminder. "Inspector, don't let this be swept under the rug. Don't let an innocent boy take the fall for other people's crimes." Woods nodded silently. As the young cop left, the inspector stirred his cooling coffee, feeling the weight of responsibility grow. He was keenly aware that pushing further could clash with his boss's wishes and provoke hostility from his peers. But the lack of real proof and the gaping holes in the investigation pushed him on. Returning to his office, Woods found a note. He was expected to submit a final report soon. Pressure was mounting. Grim-faced, he filed away his copy of the interviews and the case file. He now saw a fork in the road. He could either satisfy his superiors by concluding Luke's guilt or dig deeper for clues that might implicate Davis and others in wrongdoing. As dusk settled over the precinct, Woods knew his next move would be pivotal. More than a child's fate hung in the balance. An entire nexus of deceit was on the line. If he chose to comply, he'd become just another cog in the machine. If he chose justice, he'd spark a clash with forces possibly stronger than himself. Under the dim glow of a desk lamp, he closed the case folder and leaned back in his chair, fully aware that his real struggle was only beginning. Frank's fears for his grandson kept him awake night after night. Despite his worsening respiratory illness, he wouldn't stop fighting to prove Luke's innocence. Having served as a police officer for much of his life, he found his old investigative instincts kicking in to guide him through this desperate time. In one corner of his apartment's living room, he set up a makeshift command center with newspaper clippings, outdated files, and his personal computer. There, he pored over any detail that might poke holes in the official version of events. One morning, after spending hours poring over some shared documents from a retired colleague, he stumbled on a preliminary forensic report about the murdered shopkeeper. The files, complete with lab stamps and signatures, gave an estimated time of death based on body temperature and other scientific indicators. Frank was startled to discover that this timeline did not align with when Luke had supposedly been seen near the mini-market. In fact, The report suggested that the crime happened earlier than the statements incriminating his grandson indicated. "This changes everything," he muttered, a flicker of hope cutting through his fatigue. Clutching those invaluable files, Frank decided to contact several former police colleagues who had served with him decades ago. Although many were retired, they still had connections that sometimes produced key information. He devoted the afternoon to phone calls and emails, hunting down any lead that might support the theory of Luke's innocence. Yet each conversation drained him further. His breathing grew labored, and a dry, hacking cough compelled him to pause and lie down for a few minutes before pressing on. A sudden, violent coughing fit left Frank dizzy and clutching his chest one afternoon, without warning. Alarmed by how serious it seemed, Mariana insisted on rushing him to the hospital immediately. He refused, as stubborn as ever, asking both her and Clara Johnson, the lawyer who had started dropping by the apartment to gather information, not to fuss over him. "I've still got a little fight left, and I'm going to use it to free my grandson from this injustice," he declared, gripping his oxygen tank. The doctor at the emergency room was blunt. Frank needed complete rest and hospitalization for further tests. Yet Frank, sensing time was running out, postponed any stay at the hospital until Luke's situation was resolved. When Mariana and Clara heard Frank's account of the forensic report, their faces lit up with a mingling of hope and concern. They gathered in the same cluttered living room where Frank showed them the stamped, signed documents from the coroner. Clara, studying the paperwork intently, took in every detail that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. "If we can get this forensic analysis validated by the judge, we can prove Luke wasn't at the scene at the time of the murder," the young lawyer summarized, stressing how crucial the evidence was. Mariana spent a few minutes in silence, trembling hands clutching the papers. At long last, here was a solid chance to defend her son, a lifeline after being caught in a maze of helplessness, trying to argue the unarguable against a system far bigger and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. In those pages, in the numbers and the coroner's calculations, she saw a real opportunity to save Luke from a grim fate. Still, her joy was tempered by anguish as she watched Frank's health visibly deteriorate. Seated in his armchair with a blanket across his lap, the grandfather fought to stay alert. Every word cost him more effort, yet he refused to hold back. In a strained, uneven voice, he explained to Clara how and when to present the report and how best to highlight the contradictions in court. From his experience, he knew that evidence alone was never enough. It had to be presented decisively, leaving no room for doubt. "I doubt they'd listen to an old-timer like me," he said, turning to Clara with a quiet faith. "But you can force them to pay attention, law in hand." Finally, Frank took a labored breath and passed the documents from his trembling hand to Mariana, a gesture that symbolized passing on his investigative legacy, his last major contribution for his grandson. He sensed his strength might not last much longer, but he found comfort in the thought that, at least, he was leaving the fight for the truth on the right track. "Do what you have to do," he whispered, struggling not to succumb to exhaustion. "Use this evidence, and don't let anyone intimidate you." Mariana leaned in to embrace him, tears glistening in her eyes. Clara, moved, approached as well, thanking him for his bravery and promising to apply every ounce of legal skill to ensure the report made its mark. In that moment, with the late afternoon sun filtering through the window and casting a golden glow over the living room, Frank felt a mixed sense of weariness and fulfillment. He'd risked what little health he had left to keep a vow he'd once made to his family and the police force alike, protecting the innocent and fighting for justice. Though he knew the road ahead would be long, the faint smile on his face showed a quiet belief that his efforts might yield hope for Luke. First light found Sofia Barreto slumped over her keyboard in a secluded cubicle at the newsroom, eyes bloodshot from fatigue. She'd worked through the entire night polishing a draft of her latest article. In it, she pointed directly at Thomas Mangione as the potential enabler for the criminal dealings of the fierce Maldonado, the ringleader of the gang extorting neighborhood shopkeepers. Drawing on financial data, statements from anonymous sources, and her own investigation, Sophia sought to prove the glaring connection between political corruption and the wave of violence gripping the district. Armed with her initial findings, Sophia headed to her editor's office, Mr. Palmer, and laid the draft on his desk. He read it with a grave expression, flipping the pages in silence while she waited, apprehensive. After a few minutes, he let out a snort and shot Sophia a troubled look. "This is far too risky, Sophia," he muttered, setting the article aside. "You can't link Mangione to a criminal gang without rock-solid proof. We have to consider the legal repercussions. And besides—" "But there's more than enough evidence here," Sophia insisted firmly, swallowing the tremor in her voice. "It has to be published so people know what's happening. Listen, there are threats everywhere. We can't put ourselves in that kind of danger." Leaving his office, Sophia felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time a delicate investigation had been curtailed, but the stakes felt higher now. She'd just returned to her desk when her phone started to buzz persistently. Answering, she heard a distorted voice ordering her to drop the story. "Stop messing with powerful people or face the consequences," said the menacing voice, sending a chill down her spine. Soon afterward, she learned that Palmer himself had also received anonymous calls, warning that the newspaper's reputation would be destroyed if he let Sophia's piece run. In the hours that followed, tension spread through the newsroom. Some of her colleagues eyed her warily, unsure if publishing everything was a good idea. Her higher-ups began pressuring her, arguing the paper couldn't afford a showdown with influential politicians or risk-facing defamation lawsuits. One of the department heads even told Sophia to tone down the text, cutting direct references to Mangione and limiting it to a generic exposé of local extortion without mentioning specific names. Still, she stood firm. This wasn't just a matter of freedom of the press. It also struck at the heart of the journalistic integrity she'd always stood for. During lunch, she barely touched her food, tangled up in the dilemma of whether or not to publish the unvarnished truth. By nightfall, she had made up her mind. She would persist. The Luke Jones case, the boy sent to a reform center under questionable charges, confirmed her belief that corruption likely extended to the highest echelons of power. As a reporter, she felt duty-bound to give a voice to the voiceless. That same week, Sophia got a tip that might help reinforce her investigation. A name: Rose Brown. Word was that on the night of the murder, Rose had seen two grown men prowling near the mini-market. Hoping that her account would confirm Luke's innocence and reveal the true killers, Sophia set out to find her. It took time. Rose avoided strangers and had been changing her routine, terrified by what might happen if she spoke out about what she'd witnessed. Eventually, Sophia found her in a narrow alleyway beside the bakery where Rose occasionally helped out. At first, the woman denied seeing anything and seemed desperate to end the conversation. But the journalist's persistence and her promise to shield Rose's identity finally loosened her tongue. Nervously glancing around, Rose revealed that she'd distinctly seen two large figures, seemingly adult men, struggling at the store's entrance. She remembered hearing gunshots and shouting, after which she'd fled home in terror. She confessed she'd never reported anything to the police for fear of reprisals, and she now begged Sophia not to drag her into the matter. "Please, miss, don't put my name anywhere. I'm terrified. I saw it all, but I'd be crazy to testify," Rose whimpered, almost in tears. Sophia felt a pang in her chest. She knew this information could turn the tide for Luke's case and simultaneously expose powerful criminals, but it would also endanger Rose's life and her own. Heading back to the newsroom, she mulled over her next move. Moving forward meant putting Rose in the spotlight and ignoring the threats that still loomed over her. Backing off meant letting the guilty walk free and condemning Luke to an unfair fate. At home in the dark, lit only by the soft glow of her phone, Sophia repeatedly replayed the interviews with store owners and neighbors, combed through her notes on Rose's confession, and scanned photos linking Mangione to Maldonado. Every image, note, and audio clip was a piece of truth that might dismantle the corrupt network. Yet each also reminded her of how precarious her position was. Another sleepless night passed. She knew her actions could have serious consequences. Still, Rose's trembling plea and Luke's frightened face, she'd seen a photo provided by Mariana, spurred her on. She was on the edge of a precipice, and it was time to choose whether to leap or turn back. She realized this was the cost of being a journalist, to embrace risk in pursuit of the truth. Taking every precaution she could, Sophia resolved at dawn that she would shine light on the web of corruption everyone preferred to keep under wraps. Luke had barely spent a few weeks in the reform center, yet every day felt like a never-ending battle. Under flickering fluorescent lights and the endless clamor echoing down the hallways, he tried to maintain a low profile. But certain inmates, those with connections that reached beyond those walls, had taken note of his presence. One afternoon, on his way to the dining area, an older inmate cornered him in a corridor where the security cameras rarely worked. Without a word, the burly teen shoved him violently against the wall and delivered a punch that split his lip. "They say you're some kind of kid killer," the attacker sneered in a mocking laugh, "and out there nobody forgets, nor in here." Stunned and bleeding, Luke staggered back, a hand to his mouth. His assailant was about to strike again when Mauro suddenly stepped in. With a combative air, Mauro placed himself between the bully and Luke, pushing the older boy back hard enough to show who was in charge. The aggressor hesitated for a moment, taken aback, then snarled half-muted threats as he backed away. "If you want to survive in here, stay away from that trash," the thug spat from down the corridor. Shaking, Luke looked up at Mauro, who paused to size him up. The tension hung thick in the air, and Luke's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Mauro clicked his tongue, annoyed, and, without much fanfare, grabbed Luke by the arm and dragged him out of there. They exchanged no thanks or explanations. Still, that silent act was enough for Luke to realize he had inadvertently found a kind of protector. In his gruff, clumsy way, Mauro had decided, at least for now, not to let anyone else take advantage of the youngest kid on the block. Outside those walls, Attorney Clara Johnson was nose-deep in the case file and stacks of accumulated documents. She was discovering disturbing details about Sub-Officer Davis. One internal complaint, locked away behind bureaucratic red tape, mentioned his involvement in tampering with evidence and covering up extortion cases, although he'd never been formally charged. Clara, eyes brimming with focus, jotted down every reference to Davis and sketched out a diagram of possible corrupt alliances. It was clear that Luke's predicament went far beyond a mere slip-up. It led straight into a web that might include higher-ranking officials. The preliminary forensic report Frank had obtained now loomed like a master key to undermining the official version of events. Clara and Mariana pored over the documents on the dining room table. Frank, looking drained, coughed more and more frequently, but insisted on being there, guiding the conversation. "If we can prove the actual time of death doesn't match the police's account," Clara said, highlighting sections in the report, "we can push for a formal appeal." "And if we get a decent judge," Mariana added, "they'd have to realize Luke is innocent." Frank nodded in agreement, though he was visibly weaker with each passing day. He spent longer spells attached to his oxygen tank and paused often to catch his breath. Despite this, his hands never stopped typing messages on his phone, reaching out to old colleagues and friends in the force who might supply further evidence. "I won't give up," he muttered between coughs. "I always knew something was off in this story, and now we're getting to the bottom of it." Meanwhile, journalist Sofia Barreto fought on a different front. After receiving threats, her news outlet was wavering, reluctant to publish her investigation into Mangione's corruption and his ties to the Fierces gang. In trying to protect her sources and herself, she risked both her career and her own safety. Outside, the neighborhood remained on edge, with more shopkeepers complaining about extortion demands and the police trying to hush the uproar by taking superficial actions that avoided reeling in the real perpetrators. At the local precinct, Inspector Woods wrestled with his own internal conflict. He'd found discrepancies in Davis's reports and was clashing with superiors who wanted a quick scapegoat to soothe public anger. Torn between institutional loyalty and the urge to seek the truth, he resisted top-down pressure and feared being removed from his post. Thus, multiple battles waged on in parallel. Luke's fight to survive in a reform school infiltrated by the very criminal group that framed him. The resolve of Clara and Mariana to build an effective defense anchored by Frank's forensic discovery. Sophia's push to reveal the truth in her reports, and Woods's growing doubts about the official story. Each new effort made it clearer that Luke's case was merely the tip of an iceberg of corruption, more extensive and menacing than anyone wanted to admit. By the end of the day, Luke was in his cell, wiping his bloodied lip on his sweatshirt sleeve. He longed for his mother and grandfather, hoping against hope that any minute the cell doors would swing open and someone would announce it had all been a horrible mistake. Elsewhere, Clara sat at her desk, poised to draft a formal appeal, and Mariana, heart in her throat, prayed the wheels of justice wouldn't turn too slowly. In the living room, Frank closed his eyes in exhaustion. Labored breathing notwithstanding, he felt some relief at having found yet another thread to pull in pursuit of the truth. Despite the adversity, the fight against injustice pressed on, uniting people from different walks of life who had joined forces, however unexpectedly, around one mission: to exonerate the innocent and unmask the guilty. Inspector Logan Woods had long since grown used to wrestling with police bureaucracy, but the hurdles he encountered in Luke Jones's case went beyond the norm. He'd spent the past few hours sifting through reports, searching for any record that might clarify the timeline on the night the shopkeeper was killed. He had a hunch something wasn't right, and that suspicion blazed back to life when he finally managed to access security camera footage taken from a corner near the mini-market. However, upon playing the videos, he noticed several abrupt cuts. There were missing time segments, as though someone had deliberately removed key footage. Leaning back in his chair, the inspector frowned, jotting down the exact times where the images were missing. The tampering was obvious, but what mattered most to Woods was who had access to those recordings, and especially who had been in charge of safeguarding them. Comparing shift logs and evidence checklists, he found the same name turning up far too often: Sub-Officer Davis. This discovery didn't really surprise him. Davis was one of the first officers to arrive at the crime scene, and he'd shown an excessive eagerness to pin the blame on Luke. Woods recalled their many disagreements. There was always that overzealous urge to close the case without addressing the holes in the reports. Now, with this new finding, it made perfect sense how a 12-year-old boy had suddenly become the prime suspect. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed Davis needed a scapegoat. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Woods took a risky step. He summoned Jorge Ramirez, the young officer who had previously expressed doubts about Luke's arrest. They met in a discreet location, a run-down parking lot behind an abandoned building. Woods parked his car and waited, watching Jorge approach on foot, taking care that no one was following him. Once they were certain they were alone, the inspector showed him the inconsistencies in the surveillance footage. Jorge, visibly nervous, confirmed Woods's fears. "You're not the only one who suspects something, Inspector. Word around the station is that Davis gets paid for certain favors from powerful people." Woods's pulse quickened. He decided to press further. "Are you talking about Maldonado?" Jorge nodded. He explained that he'd overheard talk at the precinct about Davis taking care of Maldonado's interests. Evidently, the sub-officer was a key pawn in the extortion scheme that extended throughout the neighborhood. In exchange for bribes, he doctored reports, destroyed evidence, and diverted attention from the real culprits, pointing the finger at innocent people whenever it suited him. Everything indicated that Luke Jones had become the perfect target for that ploy. At Jorge's fearful gaze, Woods responded with a grateful nod. He knew the young officer was risking his position by sharing this information, proving an unusual level of courage. Meanwhile, inside the reform center, Luke was wrestling with problems of his own. The environment remained hostile, although his interactions with Mauro were improving. One afternoon, while both of them were doing their assigned cleanup in an inner courtyard, Mauro confided something he'd kept to himself for a long time. He, too, had been wrongly accused, of robbery in his case, and the real offender was a member of Maldonado's gang. But the crew, afraid Mauro knew too much, had managed to pin all the blame on him. "They sent me here like garbage," Mauro said, voice full of bitterness. "I lost my family, my studies, everything, all because I refused to be their puppet." Wide-eyed, Luke understood he wasn't the only one caught in this trap. He'd heard rumors about Maldonado's influence, but he had no idea how far it reached. Mauro's words drove home the point that the criminal gang needed someone to blame so people wouldn't suspect the real story. He recalled the wallet with his name supposedly found at the crime scene and felt a chill. How many others had been silenced or locked up to protect Maldonado's interests? Back at the precinct, Woods returned with the intel provided by Jorge, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd stumbled upon. He realized the corruption didn't stop with Davis. Higher-ranking officers were likely profiting from the criminal network as well. Still, he was beginning to piece together a clearer picture of those involved. The facts were lining up more and more, though proving them openly would be a challenge. Reflecting on Luke's situation, the inspector grew certain of the boy's innocence. No actual evidence pointed to him, only flawed and manipulated data. Now, Woods was convinced Luke was the victim of a conspiracy to protect Maldonado's shady dealings. The real question was how to expose it in a system so riddled with corruption. He'd need airtight proof, courageous testimony, and a willingness to defy orders from his superiors. As the station lights turned off and night fell across the neighborhood, Logan Woods felt a mix of resolve and fear. Stepping up to unmask Davis and the network behind him would undoubtedly put his career, and possibly more, in danger. On the other hand, he couldn't play along with sending a child to ruin, knowing full well it was a setup. Drawing a deep breath, he gathered the files documenting the irregularities and promised himself he would get to the truth, even if it meant confronting a maze of corruption. At that same moment, alone in his cell, Luke recalled Mauro's words and realized he wasn't the only one suffering an injustice. If that toughened kid, another victim deep down, had managed to survive, maybe Luke could too. Neither of them knew that on the other side of those walls, someone was beginning to pull the strings that might free them both from this web of lies. Woods, with Jorge's help, was taking on a force much greater than any of them. Yet with persistence, there was a chance that Juggernaut might finally topple if they could just expose the truth. Sofia Barreto perched on the edge of a metal chair, heart pounding in her chest. Across from her, Rose Brown clutched a small coffee cup in trembling hands, avoiding direct eye contact. Through the window's drawn curtains, a narrow alley was visible. They were in a temporary residence Sofia had arranged to record a secret statement. She'd spent days trying to convince Rose, and at last, the woman had agreed to speak. Observing her now, Sofia saw that she wasn't after attention or publicity. She was just scared to death of what might happen if she talked. "Don't worry, Rose," the journalist murmured, holding up a small lapel mic. "Just tell us what you saw. Your identity won't be made public. This is for justice." Rose took a deep breath and briefly shut her eyes, recalling that fateful night. Her voice shook as she described seeing two large hooded figures lingering near the mini-market from her kitchen window. One appeared to be carrying a weapon, arguing loudly with the shopkeeper. Although she couldn't make out their faces, she was absolutely sure neither was a child. But when the gunshots rang out, she froze and hid under her table, terrified that if she peeked out any farther, she'd be next. "Yeah, I realized they were adults, big men," she said, wiping the sweat from her brow. "After the shots, I saw them take off running. I just stayed there, not calling anyone, scared out of my mind." The recording lasted about 10 minutes, enough for her to describe each piece of her story. Sophia, aware of the risks, switched off the mic and saved the file onto an encrypted drive. She grasped Rose's hand in thanks and assured her she'd do everything possible to conceal her identity. But the woman still voiced her anxiety. "Do you think they'll find out what I did?" Rose whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll do everything I can to prevent that," Sophia replied. "But your testimony could save an innocent life." Elsewhere in the city, attorney Clara Johnson and Mariana were paying a visit to a retired forensic expert, a good friend of Frank's. After an endless bus ride, they arrived at a small chalet where they were greeted by a gray-haired man with keen eyes and a slow gait. Dr. Herrera, who had once served as head of forensic medicine for the police, had retired years before to teach. Clara showed him the preliminary report on the time of death, drafted by a colleague of Frank's, and the retired forensic specialist reviewed it carefully. "The document is well-founded," Dr. Herrera said after several minutes. "Compared with the official record, there's a clear discrepancy in the timeline. I'd go as far as saying that, based on this, Luke Jones couldn't have been at the scene when the murder took place." Mariana felt a wave of relief shiver down her spine. Clara jotted notes feverishly, determined to present this evidence in court. Only the endorsement of a pro like Herrera, whose reputation was spotless, could be the final push to get the case reopened. Before they left, Clara asked whether the doctor would be willing to testify if needed, and he agreed. "I'd do anything to clear an innocent name," Herrera said, his tone empathetic. Mariana's spirits lifted. The prospect of freeing her son no longer seemed like a distant dream, but a tangible goal, provided they could overcome a system that, so far, had preferred to blame the weakest link. While these pieces were being set in motion on the legal board, Inspector Woods pressed on with his own investigation. Thanks to Jorge Ramirez's cooperation, he was steadily gathering more intel on Maldonado's gang. Sub-Officer Davis's name cropped up repeatedly in everything from records of irregular raids to statements about under-the-table deals. Armed with that information, Woods drew up an internal report starkly contradicting the official stance, one that labeled Luke as unquestionably guilty. The inspector knew all too well that in doing so, he was challenging his superiors. Even so, he couldn't endorse a lie that condemned a child. Woods's new report, Sophia's footage, and the forensics re-evaluation formed a triangle of evidence pointing straight at the truth. Suddenly, different individuals, people who had never met, were unintentionally working together to uncover corruption and prove Luke's innocence. At the center of it all stood Frank, his health deteriorating day by day, yet whose early efforts had sparked this pursuit of justice. Nightfall found Clara and Mariana in the apartment's living room, sifting through each document, every testimony, and charting how to assemble them into a legal case to reopen proceedings. Both knew the fight wouldn't be easy. There would be threats, red tape, and they'd likely need the support of some media outlet to shine a spotlight on it. Even so, for the first time, a real glimmer of hope was in sight. "If we can get an impartial judge to see this," Clara said with a tentative smile, "I'm sure they'll force the police to re-examine the charges against Luke." Mariana echoed her smile, glancing toward the room where Frank was resting, tethered to his oxygen tank. She recalled Dr. Herrera's words, Rose Brown's confession, and Woods's report. Everything suggested the path was starting to clear. After so many sleepless nights, the hope of her son coming home no longer felt impossible. It was now a matter of playing the right cards and standing firm against those who had done so much to bury the truth. Right then, Clara's phone chimed with a message from Sophia. "I've got it on tape. Rose confirmed seeing 2 grown men. Let me know when you're ready to present evidence." It was confirmation that the journalist, too, was taking decisive steps to bolster Luke's defense. Thus, a formidable front began to emerge. Evidence, testimonies, and committed hearts resolved to break the silence. For the first time, they all felt the scales might tip in favor of the truth. In recent weeks, Inspector Logan Woods had been through a whirlwind. Each stride he took brought him closer to the truth, but also placed him under the scrutiny of higher-ups who didn't appreciate him stirring up old issues. With the staunch sense of justice he'd always carried, he'd drafted an internal report that questioned the official account of the shopkeeper's murder and Luke Jones's supposed guilt. To senior command, however, that report was practically a personal attack. Calls from headquarters came one after another, ordering him to drop any extra inquiries and stick to the initial conclusion that Luke was the murderer. One morning, a gravel-voiced captain phoned him, warning that if he insisted on defying the chain of command, he could lose his job. Woods listened in silence, swallowing anger and disbelief. He'd known corruption could reach the top, but he'd never had to confront it so directly in his entire career. Even so, once he hung up the phone, he felt more determination than fear. The evidence he had compiled, along with the information provided by Jorge Ramirez, confirmed that Sub-Officer Davis was tied to Maldonado's gang and had tampered with evidence to frame Luke. Woods realized that the boy had been the perfect scapegoat to appease the neighborhood's anger after the murder. However, handing him over to a corrupt system, knowing he was innocent, went against every principle the inspector had upheld throughout his life. That very afternoon, he made a final decision. He would arrange a meeting with Mariana and Clara Johnson at a discreet cafe near the station. He planned to give them documents that irrefutably proved the crime scene had been manipulated. Those papers, locked away in his desk, included time logs showing that Davis had picked up Luke's wallet before the forensic police officially arrived, clearly indicating he could have planted it at the scene. They also showed Davis had arrived at the mini-market several minutes earlier than he claimed in his report, destroying the supposed chain of custody. When Woods arrived at the cafe, he wore civilian clothes and had a worried frown, as if afraid of being followed. Mariana, visibly anxious, gripped a teacup she couldn't bring herself to drink from. Clara, her expression serious, stood up as soon as she spotted the inspector. He didn't bother greeting them with more than a quick nod. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and, opening it carefully, displayed its contents. "Here you go," he said in a low voice, looking around to ensure no one was listening. "It's proof that Davis lied in his report. And not just that. He tampered with the scene to pin the blame on your son, Mrs. Mariana." Mariana covered her mouth with one hand as she scanned the names, official stamps, and contradictory times. Her heart pounded at the realization they were one step closer to freeing Luke. Clara took the report carefully, fully aware that this evidence could change everything. She recognized the forensic police stamps, understood how crucial the recorded dates and times were, and knew at once that if they got this before a judge, the prosecution's case against the boy would be hard to maintain. "I have no doubt the scene was staged," the lawyer murmured. "This is blatant." Woods exhaled, relieved they grasped the magnitude of what he was showing them. Yet he also felt the weight of what would come next. By making this information public, he would be severing ties with the chain of command once and for all, exposing Davis and possibly other officers to public scrutiny. It was a brave but dangerous move. Once these documents were out, there would be no turning back. Indeed, Davis didn't take long to hear about Woods's actions, and he flew into a rage. He confronted him in the station's corridors, demanding explanations. Between clenched teeth, he threw out veiled threats, warning that if he went down, he wouldn't go alone. He spoke of dirty laundry and hinted at past missteps Woods might have made, things that could come back to haunt him. The inspector merely returned his stare with composure, resolute in the choice he had made. Justice over blind obedience. That very night, Woods locked himself in his office to draft a final report. He knew that once he handed it in, there would be no going back. The document openly held Davis responsible and detailed his ties to Maldonado's network, backed by the evidence that he and Jorge had unearthed. As he signed the last page, he felt a blend of relief and anxiety. He stamped it with the official seal, telling himself that, whatever happened, he would never regret defending an innocent life. When the station lights switched off and the noise from the street faded to a distant echo, Woods understood that his choice would put him at odds with the system. But the image of Luke, just a boy behind bars for a crime he had not committed, reminded him that his moral duty stood above any career. Stepping firmly outside, he braced himself for the consequences. He knew Luke's fate was beginning to shift, and with Clara and Mariana's help, they might yet bring down the wall of corruption that had upheld this injustice for so long. That night seemed quiet, at least so Mariana thought when she finished her usual cleaning shift at the government building. It was about 2 in the morning when, as usual, she exited through the rear door, bag slung over her shoulder, fatigue etched in her face. She headed toward the bus stop along a street lit only by a couple of flickering street lamps. Silence cloaked the area, broken only by the drone of a few transformers and the distant barking of a dog. She was deep in thought, recalling the documents Woods had given her and Clara, when suddenly she heard a deafening roar of an engine revving. A dark car with no visible plates zoomed toward her at high speed. Mariana had barely enough time to glance over her shoulder before the vehicle was right on top of her, as though it had appeared out of nowhere. Her heart pounded, and on instinct, she flung her bag to the pavement and dove aside, trying to get clear of the path. Even so, the car's bumper clipped her at a dangerous angle, knocking her to the ground. A sharp pain shot through her right arm, making her cry out immediately. The car hesitated for a split second, almost as though the driver considered returning to finish the job, but then sped off again, disappearing into the dim avenue. Dazed, with blood oozing from a shallow wound, it took Mariana a few moments to process what had just happened. She struggled to her feet, looking toward the spot where the car had vanished. In that instant, she realized it hadn't been an accident. Someone had tried to silence her. Shaking, she grabbed her phone and dialed emergency services. A patrol officer arrived several minutes later, helped her sit on the curb, and called for an ambulance. She could barely speak. Her shock was overwhelming, and her injured hand tingled with pins and needles. As the paramedic bandaged her arm, she couldn't stop telling herself through a tight throat that her fight to clear Luke's name had drawn out forces far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. A few hours later, when she finally made it back home with her arm in a cast, she found Frank in alarming condition. The old man was breathing with extreme difficulty, his eyes sunken from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. Seeing Mariana in that state, he tried to rise from his armchair, but a fit of coughing nearly left him unable to breathe. His daughter realized there was no more time to lose and immediately called for an ambulance. Paramedics arrived and recommended rushing him to the hospital. Despite everything, Frank attempted to protest, urging them not to lose sight of Luke's situation. His voice ragged, lips chapped, he managed to whisper, "Don't worry about me. Keep fighting for our boy." Mariana gently took his hand, struggling to hold back tears. She felt dealt a double blow. First, the attempt on her life, and now Luke's grandfather was in critical condition. Yet she nodded resolutely, determined not to give up. As the ambulance drove off with Frank, she couldn't stop picturing the car with no plates. She knew whoever they were, they wouldn't hesitate to do anything to protect the official story and shield the real culprits. In the juvenile facility, Luke got word of what happened from a guard who, with an indifferent tone, mentioned that his mother had been in an accident and that his grandfather was in the hospital. That news hit him like a sledgehammer. He was already coping with the aggression from other inmates and with the constant longing for freedom, but learning about his family's suffering nearly broke him. Guilt gnawed at him. Was his mother hurt because she'd been fighting to free him? Could his grandfather handle so much stress? Alone on his narrow bunk, tears slipped unchecked down his cheeks. He couldn't help imagining the worst. The day before, he'd been told Frank's condition was critical, and now he was hospitalized as an emergency. His breathing went ragged, and a knot formed in his throat, keeping him from speaking. The only one who noticed was Mauro, who approached with his tough guy stance and glanced at Luke sidelong. "Don't start bawling," he muttered in a low voice, though there was a flicker of sympathy on his face. "If they see you weak in here, they'll tear you apart. You've got to keep it together, or they'll eat you alive." Luke ducked his head, sniffing back tears. He felt Mauro's hand patting his shoulder, a clumsy, almost brotherly gesture that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. That night he stayed up, fighting back despair, tormented by the echoes of distant cell doors and the whispers snaking through the corridors. Every scream he heard seemed like another threat to his family's precarious peace. By dawn, the Jones family's life hung by a thread. Mariana was badly hurt and being hunted by unknown enemies. Frank, in critical condition, needed constant medical care, and Luke, trapped in a juvenile center permeated by Maldonado's influence. The tensions were mounting, and an all-out confrontation with those responsible was creeping ever closer. The Jones family stood on the edge of an abyss, ready to fight against time and a corrupted system that seemed determined to keep them locked in tragedy. Morning had barely broken when the police operation that Inspector Woods had been planning for weeks finally got underway. After swapping intel with Jorge Ramirez and cross-referencing various off-the-record reports, the police managed to locate one of the hideouts used by the fierce Maldonado, the ringleader behind the neighborhood's extortion rackets and illegal dealings. From inside a dark van, Woods directed the officers assigned to the raid, fully aware that this could shift the course of the investigation involving Luke Jones. The previous night had been intense at the station. In the corridors and offices, every last detail of the operation was hammered out. Entry routes, breaching tactics, and backup teams. Tension was visible in every police officer's face as they prepared to storm Maldonado's safe house, knowing the gang wouldn't hesitate to use violence. All the while, Woods remained focused on exposing the true criminals and proving Luke's innocence within a corrupt system that nearly condemned him. At first light, several police vehicles, lights switched off to avoid raising suspicion, crept along side streets, converging around a rundown three-story building in a nearly abandoned part of the district. Inside what looked like a shuttered auto repair shop, Maldonado's crew planned heists and stored weapons and stolen goods. An officer signaled to proceed, and the initial squad broke down the main door with a battering ram. The metallic squeal of yielding metal mixed with shouts of "Police, don't move," echoing in the dark hallways. Gang members scattered at once, trying to escape through back doors and windows opening onto adjacent alleys. There were crashes, doors slamming, and the clatter of objects falling as the officers searched every room. Some suspects fired back, but the entry team's quick response shut down their attempts. Within about 15 minutes, most of the resistance had been neutralized. Woods came inside after the first officers, adrenaline pumping. He walked down a corridor lit only by flickering bulbs and reached a large room serving as a makeshift office. On a table littered with papers were accounting logs and lists of names, each with numbers scribbled beside them. He recognized several nicknames from witness statements about Maldonado's henchmen. There were also details that would clearly link these extortions to influential local politicians and business owners. On the second floor, Jorge Ramirez was taking part in the sweep when he heard a commotion near a fire escape. He raced up 2 steps at a time, emerging on the rooftop just as Maldonado, the fierce himself, was trying to leap onto the next building to flee. Without thinking, Jorge lunged, grabbing him by the arm. Maldonado lashed out wildly, but the young officer managed to pin him down, shouting for backup over the radio. Within moments, 2 other cops arrived to assist, and after a short struggle, Maldonado was cuffed, his face twisted in fury. "Let me go!" he shouted, livid. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Down below, police units were sorting through the evidence, suitcases stuffed with guns, files loaded with financial notes, and even cell phones that could incriminate other key figures. Woods confirmed that these records were the missing puzzle piece to indict Maldonado and, potentially, to expose his connection to politician Thomas Mangione. Among the papers was a list of financial contributions, handwritten, suggesting that much of the dirty money had been funneled into certain political campaigns. Meanwhile, Sub-Officer Davis, who had been arrested a few days earlier under an internal order prompted by Woods's relentless efforts, realized he'd been abandoned. Once his higher-ups saw how damning the evidence against the gang was, they shifted gears to protect themselves. Cornered and threatened with decades in prison, Davis eventually confessed to placing Luke's wallet at the scene, claiming he'd received orders from above. Though he stopped short of naming Mangione outright, he dropped hints about someone powerful enough to protect him, or to throw him under the bus once things got out of hand. News of the raid and Maldonado's capture spread quickly through the neighborhood. Many shopkeepers felt tremendous relief upon learning that the brain behind their extortion nightmare was finally behind bars. Despite her injured arm and worries over Frank's health, Mariana breathed easier when Woods called to say they'd found solid documentation proving the accusations against Luke were false. Clara Johnson, for her part, saw this operation as a huge chance to strengthen the legal motion she planned to file to set the boy free. The landscape had changed. With Maldonado in custody, his crew was headless, and Davis's cooperation, though driven by fear, opened a door to indict the real masterminds. Luke, locked away in the reform facility, still had no inkling of the details, but his release now seemed closer than ever. The criminal network was beginning to topple, and the combined efforts of Woods, Jorge, Mariana, Clara, and Sophia were on the brink of unraveling the hoax that had condemned an innocent child. As the operation advanced, the long-awaited outcome loomed: Luke's freedom and the downfall of the corrupt machine that had turned him into a scapegoat. Sophia Barreto had worked into the small hours, polishing her latest exposé. Seated at a makeshift desk, she went over bank records revealed in the police raid, page by page. They itemized the millions funneled into Thomas Mangione's political campaigns, all from shadowy accounts tied to the fierce Maldonado's extortion racket. She knew this article would be the riskiest piece she'd ever publish, and also the most pivotal of her career. Despite her lingering fear of repercussions, she pressed on, driven by the journalistic duty to uncover the truth. With the report finally complete, Sophia sent it to her editor with a terse email. "Publish immediately, no edits. I take full responsibility." To her surprise, the digital outlet approved the piece with minimal changes. Perhaps they couldn't hide a scandal of such magnitude any longer. Within hours, the internet was flooded with the news. Who benefits from extortion? The Mangione-Maldonado connection comes to light. In it, Sophia presented documents, bank statements, and testimony exposing the flow of illicit money into local campaigns and municipal projects. The reaction was explosive. Upon hearing the news, Thomas Mangione was forced to call a press conference the next day. He appeared with a somber expression, flanked by advisors and clutching a carefully prepared speech. He categorically denied any link to Maldonado's gang, calling the accusations slanderous lies and alleging a political witch hunt. But the media and public pressure only intensified. Reporters hammered him with pointed questions about the financial evidence Sophia had published. His lack of convincing answers and his obvious nervousness merely poured fuel on the fire. At the same time, the local district attorney's office announced new inquiries. Word leaked that Mangione's name turned up in several documents seized during the Maldonado raid, and that this evidence pointed directly to the use of illegal funds raised through extortion. Overnight, the politician's image, previously bolstered by his boasts of improving security and neighborhood welfare, crumbled in the eyes of the public. Editorials and newscasts demanded his immediate resignation, while many of his allies either abandoned him or offered only lukewarm statements to avoid being tarnished. Meanwhile, Maldonado, already behind bars after the raid, received visits from investigators seeking confirmation of his ties to Mangione. At first, the criminal remained arrogant and uncooperative. However, as evidence mounted and a long prison sentence for murder and extortion loomed, his resolve wavered. Little by little, he began revealing information that proved to be the missing piece of the puzzle. He confirmed that the shopkeeper was killed because he refused to pay the protection fee. Maldonado coldly admitted he needed to set an example to discourage other merchants from rebelling. The problem was that it kicked up too much noise, he added, avoiding the agent's gaze. Someone on the force told us there was a perfect kid to pin it on, so everyone would think it was an isolated case. The investigators, recorder in hand, exchanged astonished looks. Maldonado gave no specific names, but spoke of someone with good connections who pulled strings within the precinct. This validated the suspicions of evidence tampering that had kept Luke Jones as the prime suspect. With these revelations, the scheme was laid bare. Not only was there a link between Mangione and Maldonado's criminal funds, but part of the police structure had also helped cover it up. While Mangione wavered in the harsh glare of public attention, the proceedings to review Luke's case gathered momentum. Maldonado's confession and confirmation that the shopkeeper's death was retaliation placed the DA's office in a tight spot. They could no longer ignore the mounting evidence contradicting the initial version that portrayed Luke as the killer. Moreover, the documentation provided by Inspector Woods and attorney Clara Johnson now carried fresh weight. It contained clear indications that Davis and other corrupt officers had planted the evidence framing the boy. In a tense environment, streets teeming with reporters and protesters demanding Mangione's resignation, everything pointed to a high-profile trial for the politician. Even some council members and officials who once loyally backed him began publicly distancing themselves, claiming total ignorance of his illegal dealings. Mangione's fall looked inevitable. Formal charges were only a matter of time, and his reputation, at least in the eyes of the public, lay in ruins. Amid this chaos, Mariana found a glimmer of hope. In the hospital room, with Frank still frail yet closely following the news, she realized that all the truths about the extortion and the murder were finally coming to light. Luke, locked up behind reform school walls, only got bits and pieces of the outside developments, but those scraps were enough to raise his spirits. He knew that with the criminal ring dismantled and Mangione's downfall imminent, his chances of finding justice grew significantly. Sophia's exposé had detonated a political and legal crisis that shook the very foundations of a corruption network, which, not long before, had brazenly ruled the neighborhood. With Mangione on the brink, the push to reopen Luke's case sped up, and Maldonado's statements cast doubt on the entire chain of command. The criminal machine had lost its most respectable facade, and the likely indictment of the politician seemed only the first step toward a conclusion that, more clearly each day, heralded the exoneration of an innocent boy who should never have been jailed. The morning sun cast a pale gold tint over the courthouse steps when Clara Johnson arrived, case file under her arm. By her side, Mariana walked with her heart in her throat, aware that this day could change everything for her son, Luke. Despite her anxiety, she clung to the hope pinned on the new evidence, the forensic report contradicting the timing of the shopkeeper's death, Rose Brown's testimony confirming she had seen two grown men at the scene, Sub-Officer Davis's confession to having rigged evidence, and Inspector Woods's findings about Maldonado's criminal network. As the two women crossed the lobby, they sensed the curious and journalistic eyes upon them. It was no surprise. Ever since Sofia Barreto's explosive article and the subsequent police breakthroughs, Luke's case had dominated city headlines. People were outraged to learn that a 12-year-old had spent months behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Media pressure was so intense that Judge Vilches, known for his toughness, had agreed to an extraordinary review of the case. In the courtroom, the buzz died down to a hush when Vilches entered, wearing a stern expression. Even so, he couldn't completely hide his own nerves. He felt the gaze of the press and the public on him. From the bench, he announced that the new hearing, driven by the defense's filing on Luke's behalf, was now in session. An expectant whisper rippled through the audience. Clara opened by laying out each piece of gathered evidence. She started with the forensic analysis contradicting the initial version, proving that the estimated time of the shopkeeper's death did not match the police reports. Next, she called Rose Brown to the stand. Nervous but determined, Rose confirmed she had seen two large, hooded men the night of the crime. not a young boy. She explained she'd hidden for fear of retaliation, but thanks to Sofia Barreto's help, she'd chosen to come forward. The journalist Sofia then took the stand, explaining how she had recorded Rose's anonymous confession at first and detailing the pressures she faced when attempting to publish her exposé on Maldonado's corruption. She testified that the threats against her made it clear that someone wanted the truth buried, concluding that Luke had been made a scapegoat for a broader criminal network. Next came Inspector Woods, a key figure. He methodically outlined the police misconduct, detailing how Davis had taken possession of Luke's wallet before forensic teams officially arrived, and how footage from nearby security cameras had been edited to pin the blame on the boy. Woods added that Luke's rushed arrest served to cover the interests of Maldonado's gang and possibly those of higher-ups in both law enforcement and local politics. He mentioned the newly revealed connections with Thomas Mangione. The final bombshell was the signed confession from Davis, stating he had planted the boy's wallet at the crime scene on orders from unnamed superiors. Though he gave no precise names, his admission proved that from the outset, the official investigation had been tainted. Once these testimonies ended, Clara delivered her closing argument, underscoring the injustice inflicted on a minor who'd spent months in detention without any real evidence. Calm but resolute, she stressed that this scandal had harmed not only Luke and his family, but also the integrity of the judicial system itself. As she spoke, Mariana, seated among the spectators, squeezed Frank's hand, and despite his frail state, he had insisted on being there. Judge Vilches reviewed all the documents, listened to both the prosecution and the defense, and then withdrew to deliberate with his fellow magistrates. The wait dragged on for nearly an hour, an eternity for Mariana and Frank. Finally, the judge returned, face set in a grave expression, and after adjusting his glasses, he pronounced in a clear voice, "This court finds the evidence presented to be conclusive in establishing the innocence of Luke Jones. The conviction against him is hereby overturned, and his immediate release is ordered." Those words triggered an explosion of pent-up relief. Mariana broke into sobs as she embraced Frank, while Clara slumped into her chair with a triumphant grin. Several reporters in the audience fired off urgent questions, and the judge, raising his hand, stated that more details would be given in the formal written decision. A few hours later, the Reform Center gates swung open for Luke. Wearing the juvenile detention uniform, he stepped forward timidly, fearful that something might go wrong at the last second. But all he saw was Mariana's tear-streaked face, aglow with a smile that lit up the entire scene. He almost ran to her, clinging to her in a desperate hug, finally feeling the crushing weight of injustice lift from his shoulders. Off to the side, Frank, breathing heavily and leaning on his oxygen tank, watched with misty eyes, proud to have helped make that moment possible. Applause and camera flashes filled the scene. Standing a bit behind them, Clara felt a lump in her throat as she witnessed the family reunion. Inspector Woods, keeping a low profile, also looked on, knowing that this victory marked the end of a dark chapter for local justice. Yet even in the joy of seeing Luke free, questions remained. Frank still fought for his life, and the criminal network involving politicians and high-ranking officers hadn't been fully dismantled. But in that victorious instant, what mattered most was that Luke was going home, exonerated of a crime he never committed. The scales of justice had finally tipped the right way, and a new path of hope was emerging for the Jones family. The setting sun cast its last rays on the grey facade of General Hospital when Luke and Mariana rushed inside, pushing through the revolving door at the main entrance. A nurse directed them to Frank's room, where the old man lay in critical condition after a sudden turn for the worse the night before. While Luke's release, so longed for by everyone, had finally come, it coincided with the alarming decline of his grandfather's health. Their hearts pounding, mother and son navigated the hallway steeped in the smell of disinfectant, struggling to cope with this intense mix of relief and dread. Upon entering the room, they found Frank pale and struggling to breathe, hooked to an oxygen tank and surrounded by monitors emitting sporadic beeps. A doctor with a compassionate look told them they were doing everything possible to stabilize him, but the respiratory illness afflicting him was relentlessly advancing. Luke approached the bed and gently clasped his grandfather's hand, tears threatening to slip free no matter how hard he tried. "Grandpa, I'm free now," the boy murmured, forcing his voice not to waver. I know, son," Frank replied, voice barely audible, but his gaze alight with pride. Mariana leaned down to embrace him tenderly, wiping away the tears that kept falling. She recounted, through sobs, the details of the hearing, how the judge had overturned Luke's conviction once the forensic evidence, Davis's confession, and Rose Brown's testimony were presented. Frank managed a faint smile and lifted his head a fraction to look at his grandson. Even in the room's dim light, the satisfaction in his misty eyes shone through. He felt that the relief of seeing Luke set free repaid every effort he'd made, every phone call, every file pored over, and every toll his own health had taken. That night, as Luke and Mariana took turns keeping vigil over Frank, the old man looked at his family one last time. Summoning all his strength, he fixed his gaze on Luke, as if trying to pass on a final reserve of courage. A soft whisper escaped his lips. "Go on, champ. You beat injustice." His words faded into silence. Moments later, the monitor's alarms began flashing, and the floor erupted in confusion as the on-duty nurses rushed in. Mariana, overcome, held her father, while Luke, dazed, watched the medical team's frantic attempts to stabilize him. Yet Frank's heart could give no more. His eyes closed at last, leaving only a final, peaceful expression on his face. He had departed this world with a clear conscience, having rescued his grandson from a wrongful fate. Grief took hold of the room. Mariana wept uncontrollably, clutching Frank's still form, while Luke stood trembling, tears streaking his cheeks. Though just a child, he grasped the magnitude of his grandfather's sacrifice. He felt that Frank had given his final ounce of strength out of love and a sense of justice, and that he, Luke, was bound to honor that legacy by living with the same integrity and courage. Word of Frank's death spread quickly. Hours later, Inspector Woods and the young policeman Jorge Ramirez arrived at the hospital, having stayed close to the family throughout their ordeal. Both men offered their condolences with solemn expressions, embracing Mariana and Luke. Woods, brow knitted, lamented that such an upright man had been forced to endure so much stress and exhaustion, adding that without Frank's efforts, they likely never would have uncovered the hidden threads of the conspiracy. Sofia Barreto, for her part, sent a large bouquet of white flowers along with a message of condolence. In her note, the journalist highlighted Frank's courage and his vital role in exposing the corruption surrounding Luke's case. Despite everyone's grief, a firm conviction took root that the old man had departed having fulfilled his mission: protect the innocent, stand firm against injustice, and leave an open path for truth to prevail. As the clock ticked on with cruel indifference, Luke, seated in a hospital corridor, felt the weight of reality bearing down on him. His grandfather, an unrelenting investigator who had harnessed his police experience for Luke's sake, would no longer be there to guide him. From that moment on, he would have to forge his own path without Frank's steady hand. Even so, he understood that every lesson his grandfather had passed on, about honesty, justice, and unshakable faith in the truth, would live on in his memory. That night forever changed the Jones family. Luke and Mariana knew that, despite his release and the joy of seeing the truth come to light, they now had to cope with the irreplaceable absence of their strongest pillar. Frank left as a silent hero, unknown to many, but unmatched by those who understood his sacrifice. A freedom won at such great cost left an indelible mark on their hearts, a reminder of the battle waged when ordinary people dare to challenge injustice. With Frank's final breath, one cycle ended, and another began for the Jones family, one filled with lessons learned. Early morning light filtered through the window of the modest apartment where Luke was finally able to sleep without nightmares. Gone were the endless days in the reform center, the dread of an unjust trial, and the anguish that had permeated every corner of his family's life. A new dawn brought a very different future, one brimming with possibilities. That morning, Mariana stepped into his room and gently knocked on the door, calling to him in a calm voice, "Son, it's time to get up. You have track practice." Luke slowly sat up, eyes still half closed. He thought of Frank in every corner of the home and felt a pang of nostalgia. Yet that sadness softened a little when he remembered all his grandfather had done for him. Drawing on fresh resolve, he rose and got ready to head back to school, determined to return to his routine with the conviction of someone who had picked himself up after an unjust blow. At the school, he reconnected with teacher Alice Suarez, the PE instructor who had always believed in his athletic potential. The moment she saw him step onto the track, she greeted him with a huge smile and hugged him, ignoring the commotion of the other students. Everyone was stunned to see Luke back, but within a few minutes of running laps on the asphalt, he showed he hadn't lost his touch. His strides were firm, almost liberating, as if with every step he were leaving behind the memory of grey prison walls. Satisfied, Alice confided that there would soon be a local tournament he could enter. Luke felt a buzz of excitement. Deep down, he knew this was the chance he'd always dreamed of, and one he could finally pursue without obstacles. As Luke took his first laps around the track, other stories came to a close beyond the schoolyard. After the boys' release and Thomas Mangione's spectacular downfall, attorney Clara Johnson had become a prominent figure in the public defender's office. Her brilliant handling of Luke's defense, along with her courage in confronting institutional corruption, had catapulted her to recognition she'd never imagined. She was now overseeing other high-profile cases, determined to keep using the law as a shield for the most vulnerable. Sofia Barreto, too, was reaping the rewards of her journalistic boldness. Her exposé on Mangione, revealing his ties to Maldonado's gang, had become a benchmark for press freedom in the city. Major media outlets didn't waste time making her job offers that promised stability and greater reach. Though the memory of anonymous threats still weighed on her, she took enormous satisfaction in having done her duty and helping expose the injustice. At the station, Inspector Logan Woods faced a new reality. Even after all he'd endured, seeing some of his superiors fall from grace, he chose to remain in the police force. He believed that quitting would mean abandoning those officers, like Jorge Ramirez, who were committed to the force's genuine purpose. Indeed, Jorge stayed on at the precinct, head held high, proud to have helped secure justice for Luke and trusting that his work would continue to make a difference for other victims of corruption. Meanwhile, there was someone Luke couldn't stop thinking about: Mauro. The memory of that tough but loyal young man who had protected him during his darkest moments spurred Luke to visit him at the Reform Center soon after his own release. Stepping inside, he felt that same oppressive atmosphere that had once weighed on him so heavily. He found Mauro sitting on a bench, elbows on his knees, surrounded by 2 or 3 inmates who had become his makeshift family behind bars. When Mauro spotted Luke, he stood up with a look of surprise and a tentative smile. "What are you doing here, kid?" he barked in the same gruff tone as ever, though his eyes betrayed gratitude. Luke explained that he had come to thank him for everything he'd done. Visibly moved, Mauro muttered that maybe his own story would take a turn for the better. Now that Maldonado's gang was weakened, perhaps they'd reopen the judicial process that had unfairly convicted him. Hope sparked in both of them. Luke realized that just as he'd found justice, there was a chance Mauro could also regain his freedom and reclaim his future. The days rolled on, and the Jones family's life gained new stability. Although Frank's absence remained an unfillable void, his presence lived on in every one of Luke's achievements. The young athlete signed up for the local track and field tournament, encouraged by teacher Alice and buoyed by the memory of his grandfather. On the day of the meet, Mariana took a seat in the stands, clutching a handkerchief she used to dab at tears of pride. Nearby, Clara, and even Inspector Woods, showed up among the spectators, eager to cheer Luke on in this new beginning. When the whistle signaled the start of the race, Luke shot forward on the track, remembering how Frank had always talked to him about honesty, courage, and justice. He felt he was running not just for himself, but for everyone who had believed in his innocence and risked so much to rescue him from an unjust fate. As he rounded the curve, he could hear the cheers of Mariana and the crowd's thunderous applause. A wave of warmth spread through his chest, aware that despite everything he'd endured, he had managed to claim both his freedom and his dream of being an athlete. In that moment, a burst of sunlight broke through the clouds, seeming to light the entire track. As he ran, Luke exhaled, letting go of the ghosts of his past, and casting a glance at the bleachers, he found his mother's proud gaze. Within it, he could see Frank's echo, a quiet hero whose integrity had vanquished corruption. Clearly, when people stand together with courage and resolve, the truth can shine brighter than any darkness. Thus, the sound of applause and the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers on the track sealed a hopeful ending to this story. And though new challenges might lie ahead, Luke was ready. He had learned that sometimes it only takes a few people brave enough to stand up to change a fate that seemed all but sealed. In this shared longing for justice and freedom, the Jones family now discovered a new horizon, inspired by Frank's unforgettable legacy and heartened by the triumph of the truth. Thanks for staying with us until the end. We bid farewell, happy to know we shared each moment with you. If you enjoyed it, give us a like and subscribe so we can keep living more adventures together. See you soon.